Handbook of Abhidhamma Study by Venerable Sayadaw Silananda. Read by Dhammakami. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Veneration to the Exalted One, homage worthy, the perfectly self-enlightened, the Buddha. What is Abhidhamma? Is it a philosophy? Is it psychology? Is it ethics? Nobody knows. Sayadaw Thitila is a Burmese monk who spent many years in the West. He is still living in Burma. He may be about 97 years old now. He said it is a philosophy, inasmuch as it deals with the most general causes and principles that govern all things. So it can be called a philosophy. You can find it in the causes and principles that govern all things. It is an ethical system, because it enables one to realize the ultimate goal, Nibbana. There are no ethical teachings in Abhidhamma actually. There are no teachings like you are not to do this or that. You are to refrain from this. There are no such teachings in Abhidhamma. But when it describes consciousness, it begins with what is unwholesome. It goes to consciousness of sensuous sphere. Then it goes to higher states of consciousness called fine material sphere consciousness. Then again, it goes to immaterial sphere types of consciousness. And ultimately, it goes to supramundane consciousness. It goes from one spiritual stage to another. So it can be called ethics. As it Abhidhamma deals with the working of the mind with thought processes and mental factors, it can be called a system of psychology. It is really a system of psychology because it deals with the mind, matter, consciousness, mental factors, and material properties. Therefore, Abhidhamma is generally translated as psycho-ethical philosophy of Buddhism. I want to call it just Abhidhamma. I think that is better. When we say it is Buddhist psychology, it is psychology, but it is more than that. We may call it philosophy. Again, it is more than that. We may call it ethics. It is ethics, but it is more than that. So we will never do justice to translate it as psychology, philosophy, or ethics. It is better to just call it Abhidhamma, as we Burmese do. I always tell people we Burmese are very smart people. We do not translate these terms into Burmese. We just Burmanize them. So let's just call it Abhidhamma. In Abhidhamma you find something of philosophy, much of psychology, and also of ethics. The importance of Abhidhamma. Now let us talk about the importance of Abhidhamma. Is it the knowledge of Abhidhamma important? If you ask me, I will say yes. Abhidhamma is not only necessary in my opinion, but essential for a correct and thorough understanding of Buddha's teachings. Please do not be discouraged when I say this. You will not understand the suttas correctly and thoroughly if you do not understand the teachings of Abhidhamma. Many teachings in the suttas have to be understood against the background of Abhidhamma. It is something like a guide or guideline for understanding the teachings of the suttas. In Dhammapada, this is a sutta, the Buddha said, "Do not do any evil or do not do what is bad. Do what is good. If we are to avoid evil, we need to know what is evil, what is unwholesome. Sometimes we may think something is wholesome, while actually it is unwholesome. Or sometimes we may think something is unwholesome, while it is wholesome. We need to understand which is evil and which is good, that we can understand with the help of Abhidhamma. Abhidhamma teaches us that whatever is associated with greed, hatred, and delusion is evil, is unwholesome. Whatever is associated with the opposites of these three unwholesome states, that is, non-greed, non-hatred, that means loving kindness, and non-delusion or knowledge or understanding is wholesome. If you do not know Abhidhamma, you may be at a loss as to what is evil and what is not. In some suttas, Buddha said, a monk develops the path. Path consciousness is a type of consciousness that arises at the moment of enlightenment. According to Abhidhamma, path consciousness arises only once. It never repeats. In that sutta, the Buddha said, the monk develops the path. But according to the teachings of Abhidhamma, path consciousness only arises once. The meaning to understand there is that the monk practices meditation further to reach the higher stages of enlightenment, to reach the higher paths. If we do not understand that, we will understand it incorrectly. There are many places like this in the suttas. Without the knowledge of Abhidhamma, you will always misunderstand or you will not fully understand. So, in my opinion, the Abhidhamma is essential for the correct understanding and for the thorough understanding of the teachings given in the suttas. Is knowledge of Abhidhamma essential for meditation? Then there is another question. When we want to practice meditation, do we need the knowledge of Abhidhamma? There can be different answers, yes and no. There is a book called Visuddhimagga. It was written by Venerable Buddhaghosa in the 5th century AD. It is actually a handbook for meditating monks. It describes the practice of meditation from the foundation of purity of morals up to the attainment of enlightenment. When describing vipassana meditation, the author taught in that book the essentials of Abhidhamma about aggregates, bases, elements, faculties, Paticca Samuppada, dependent origination. He said, this is the basis for knowledge. Knowledge means vipassana knowledge. Just looking at it, as we might conclude that we must study Abhidhamma before we can practice vipassana meditation. But when we look at the stories where a person came to the Buddha and the Buddha preached to him and he gained enlightenment, or he became an Arya, he did not know Abhidhamma. Still, he became enlightened. So in my opinion, knowledge of Abhidhamma is not absolutely essential for realization of truth. Even if you do not know Abhidhamma, you can practice vipassana and you can get results. It is extremely helpful, however, to have knowledge of Abhidhamma. It is like reading a map before you go to a place. When you reach that place, you don't have to be told because you already know which is which. It is something like that. Knowledge of Abhidhamma is very helpful. It is good, as you are doing now, to study the Abhidhamma a little before you practice meditation. But there are some teachers who think that it is essential. You must know Abhidhamma before you practice Vipassana. Knowledge of Abhidhamma is good to have. Is Abhidhamma necessary for understanding the teachings? There are some, especially scholars, who think Abhidhamma is not necessary for understanding the suttas. One person wrote like this: the third division of the Pali Canon, the Abhidhamma Pitaka, need not to be considered at length, for it differs from the sutta literature already discussed only in being drier, more involved and more scholastic. Originality and depth are comparatively lacking, and our knowledge of Buddhist philosophy would be a little less if the Abhidhamma Pitaka were altogether ignored. He means that though you don't know Abhidhamma, your knowledge of Buddhist philosophy would not be less. You don't need Abhidhamma to understand Buddhist philosophy. The author of that quote was Ananda K. Kumaraswamy. This was written in his book, Buddha and the Gospel of Buddhism. He said originality and depth are comparatively lacking. Maybe originality is lacking because the same things are taught in Abhidhamma as in the Sutta Pitaka and Vinaya Pitaka. There may be no new subjects taught in Abhidhamma, but depth I will let you decide for yourself. I will not say anything more. So, whether you think it is shallow, or it is deep, or it is profound, or whatever, you will understand later after you go through this course. This is another person who wrote something like that. Perhaps Kumaraswamy got his idea from that book. It is called The History of Indian Literature by a German author, Maurice Winternitz. He wrote something like this: there are so many synonyms given. There is no originality. They might have picked up a book of Abhidhamma and just saw enumerations, synonyms and others, and became disillusioned with Abhidhamma. Before you can pick up a book of Abhidhamma and read it and understand it, you have to have some knowledge of the fundamentals of Abhidhamma. Without a fundamental knowledge, you cannot go directly to books in Abhidhamma Pitaka. If you do not know the multiplication table, you cannot do math. You cannot go to arithmetic and do the sums without the multiplication table. That is until some time ago. Nowadays people use calculators. You do not need to learn multiplication tables. Without basic knowledge, it is almost impossible to go to any kind of knowledge. So you need some kind of fundamental knowledge of Abhidhamma before you go to the Abhidhamma itself. Without that knowledge, whatever book you pick up, it will be like Greek to you. Sayadaw Titila said, Abhidhamma is highly prized by the profound students of Buddhist philosophy, but to the average student, it seems dull and meaningless. If you pick up an Abhidhamma book, even if you understand Pali, you will find it very dull and boring. This is because it is so extremely subtle in its analysis and so technical in its treatment that it is very difficult to understand without the guidance of an able teacher. You may read a book on Abhidhamma and understand to some extent, but I think you need a teacher to guide you through Abhidhamma. That is probably why the Abhidhamma Pitaka is not as popular as the other two Pitakas among the Western Buddhists. Maybe not only Western Buddhists, but also modern scholars. Ananda Kumaraswamy was not a Westerner, he was an Oriental. So it is not so popular even with scholars in the Orient because it is extremely subtle in its analysis and extremely technical in its treatment. You will see that when you pick up a book of Abhidhamma and read it, I will not say those statements is true. You can find out for yourself later after you have gone through the course. How Buddha taught Abhidhamma. Let's go to the 7 books of Abhidhamma and the commentaries. Abhidhamma is a vast literature. Buddha taught Abhidhamma to gods and not to human beings. In the 7th rainy season after his enlightenment, the Buddha went up to Tawatimsa heaven and preached Abhidhamma to the gods there. His mother, who died 7 days after his birth, was born a deva, as a deity, in another heaven called Dusita heaven. He or she, we believe that she was reborn as a male deity, came down to Tawatimsa heaven and listened to the Abhidhamma taught by the Buddha. It is said that the Buddha taught non-stop for 3 whole months. When I say non-stop, I really mean non-stop. Buddha was a human being, so he needed to eat and so on. When it was time for alms round, he created another Buddha by his mental power. He willed that the created Buddha teach Abhidhamma from such and such a place to such a place during his absence. Then he went down to human world for alms. At that time, the created Buddha took over. When he went down to the human world, the Venerable Sariputta met him there. When the Buddha met Sariputta, he told him that he had taught a particular portion of Abhidhamma during the interval. That means between their meeting the day before and the present today. What the Buddha said to Sariputta was just something like a table of contents. When Sariputta heard this, he was able to understand down to the smallest detail what the Buddha had taught. He was so endowed with analytical knowledge. He understood all that the Buddha taught during the interim. When Sariputta went back to his place, he taught the Abhidhamma he had learned from the Buddha to 500 monks who were his disciples. Then the Buddha, after spending the day in the human world, went back to Tawatimsa heaven in the evening and resumed his teaching. Did the deities know that the Buddha had left and that a created Buddha was preaching at that moment? Some did and some did not. Those who had greater power knew, and those who had lesser power did not, because there was no difference between the Buddha and the created Buddha as regards their race, their voices, their words. Everything was exactly the same. It was an exact replica. Those deities of lesser power did not know. It is said that the Buddha spoke very quickly. How quickly? During the time an ordinary person speaks 1 word, the Buddha could speak 128 words. Buddha spoke very fast. Even a discourse given after taking a meal at a house could run into the size of 1 Nikaya. Now imagine the Buddha talking in that way for 3 months without stopping, continuously preaching. So the volume of Abhidhamma could be very great. We have 3 versions of Abhidhamma that taught to the gods, which is very large. Then the second that was taught to the Venerable Sariputta, like a table of contents. And the third one that the Venerable Sariputta taught to his disciples, that is neither too large nor too small. The Venerable Sariputta made it suitable for those monks to accept. He did not teach all that he knew. He taught just enough for them. So there are 3 versions of Abhidhamma. Fortunately, that the last version, which is neither too large nor too small, was recorded at the first Buddhist council. That version is what we have as Abhidhamma now. I want to show you the Abhidhamma books. There are 12 books. I added up the pages. The pages are all together 4,981 pages. There are 7 books of Abhidhamma, but in our edition there are 12 volumes. Those 4,981 pages contain many ellipses. There are repetitions, or there are some that are not difficult for the reciters to put in, and so they are left out. If everything were printed in full, it could be 10 times greater than what we have here. The Abhidhamma is very wide and very large. The 7 books of Abhidhamma. There are 7 books of Abhidhamma. The first one is Dhamma Sangani, classification of dhammas. That means classification of jittas, consciousness, cetasikas, mental factors, and rupa, matter. The second book is called Vifanga, that is, analysis of dhammas. The subjects taught in Dhamma Sangani are further analyzed. The third one is called Tatukatha, discussion of the dhammas. It is a discussion of dhammas taught in the Dhamma Sangani. The fourth is called Bukkala Panyati, designation of types of beings. This book is not like Abhidhamma. It is like sutta discourses. Different types of individuals or different types of beings are classified or mentioned. This is one book which is not like Abhidhamma. The next one is Kathawatu, points of controversy. It is also not like Abhidhamma. It is a book of debate. Different opinions current at that time were examined on the basis of debate. It is very different from other books. It is a dialogue between Theravada monks and other monks. The 6th book is called Yamaka, Book of Pairs. That means there are questions and answers in pairs. There are questions in pairs. There are answers in pairs. For example, there are wholesome states. Are all those wholesome states wholesome roots? There are wholesome roots. Are all those wholesome roots wholesome states? It is something like that. And also with regards to aggregates, bases, and so on, there are questions and answers like that, which go in pairs. The 7th book is called Bhatthana. It is the book of causal relations. There are 24 modes of causal relations. The Abhidhamma is the largest of the 7 books of Abhidhamma, and to us it is the deepest, the most profound book of Abhidhamma. In our books, it is said that the Buddha contemplated on the Abhidhamma in the 4th week after his enlightenment. He did not preach to anyone. He just sat down and contemplated on the Abhidhamma. When he contemplated on the first 6 books, nothing happened. He just contemplated on them. But when he contemplated on the 7th book, the 6 colored rays were emitted from his body. They came out of his body. We don't have a Buddhist flag here. A Buddhist flag represents these 6 rays: blue, yellow, red, white, orange, and the mixture of these 5. Why was that? The other 6 books were not deep enough for the Buddha's super wisdom. When he was contemplated on these 6 books, it was like a whale put in a small tank. He could barely move in the tank. But when coming to the 7th book, the subject matter was measureless, and his wisdom was measureless. His wisdom could go as far as the subject matter went, and the subject matter could go as far as his wisdom could go. When he reached the 7th book, he was like that whale put in the ocean. He could move about very easily, and so he became very glad. When the mind becomes glad, it affects the physical parts of the body. So the rays came out of his body. Abhidhamma is the most profound of the 7 books and also the largest. These are the 7 books of Abhidhamma, but we are not going to study these 7 books. What we are going to study is just an approach to these books. So you have to go a long way. The commentaries, sub-commentaries, and sub-commentaries will be continued on the next video. Thank you, Dhamma friends, for listening to Abhidhamma Studies by Sayadaw Silananda, read by Dhammakami. Sharing of merits. May all beings share in the merits gained, enjoy good health, prosperity and happiness, cultivating loving kindness and wisdom, culminating in the cessation of all suffering. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May the light of Abhidhamma lead us towards the path of enlightenment.